She paid for seat 1A. They gave her 28E by the toilet. Flight attendant Vanessa thought she could quietly move Evelyn Brooks to the back of the plane. A middle-aged black woman in a navy coat? Easy target. No explanation, no apology, just quiet dismissal. The man in her seat sipped champagne. The crew looked away. But when they picked Evelyn, they didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know Evelyn was the lead investor in the airline's billion-dollar expansion deal. And what came next wasn't just justice, it was exposure. A reckoning played out at 30,000 feet and watched by millions on the ground. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one woman, it's about all of us. Sunlight spilled across the quiet tarmac as the aircraft taxied to its gate. Inside, silence settled like fog. Passengers waited, eyes shifting. At the front of the plane, a delegation gathered, and in row 32, Evelyn Brooks quietly stood. Evelyn Brooks walked through gate 17 with the quiet assurance of a woman who had worked twice as hard for half the recognition. Her navy blue coat clung to her shoulders like armor, and the boarding pass in her hand read 1A, a first-class window seat she had purchased 3 weeks ago for a red-eye to London. It was not a matter of comfort. It was necessity. A crucial presentation awaited her across the ocean, and the seat by the window gave her a rare chance to rest and prepare. The gate agent had smiled politely, scanned her ticket, and waved her through. All was well until she stepped onto the plane. Near the aircraft door, a flight attendant named Vanessa stood poised, platinum blonde hair in a taut bun, uniform crisp and smile tight like a drawn line. Evelyn nodded at her, receiving only a nod in return. Nothing was said, but something shifted. Barely perceptible, yet unmistakable. When Evelyn reached row 1, her seat, 1A, was already occupied. A man in a tailored gray suit sat there, reading a newspaper with the serene indifference of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She cleared her throat gently and stated her seat number. The man didn't look up. Vanessa appeared instantly, as if rehearsed. She asked for Evelyn's ticket, glanced at her tablet, and after a slight pause delivered the verdict. There's been a reassignment. You'll be in 28E. Middle seat. Back row. By the restrooms. No apology, no explanation. For a moment, time slowed. Evelyn stood still, her mind spinning with disbelief, but she didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. With the grace of someone long used to such slights, she walked down the narrow aisle as heads turned, some curious, others smug. Her rightful place was being taken, and no one said a word. Have you ever been asked to leave a space you rightfully belong to just because someone else thought you didn't fit the picture? As she passed the man now sipping champagne in her seat, Evelyn's heels tapped softly against the carpeted floor like a quiet protest. A seat was taken, yes, but something deeper had just been stolen, and the plane hadn't even left the ground. She didn't cry, she didn't sigh, but deep inside, something had begun, something they would all come to remember. Seat 28E was as dismal as it sounded, tucked between a restless teenager and a coughing elderly man, right beside the humming restroom door. Evelyn settled in without a word. Her coat remained folded neatly on her lap, her briefcase wedged underfoot. The plane's cabin grew warm with the thrum of bodies and recycled air. She stared straight ahead, composed on the outside, but her thoughts, sharp and swift, were already reaching for clarity. This wasn't about a reassignment. It was about the message beneath it. She had learned, over years of closed doors and forced smiles, how prejudice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. With deliberate calm, Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. Not to text, not to scroll, but to document. She opened a secure notes app and began to type, each word a quiet record. Seat removed without cause, no written notice, no apology, names, time, row number. The start of a story the airline never expected to be written. She wasn't angry. Yet. But she was alert. And alert, for a woman like Evelyn, was its own kind of armor. Across the aisle, someone muttered, "Probably got bumped last minute." The tone wasn't cruel, just casual. The way some people comment on things they think don't matter. Evelyn didn't turn. She had heard worse. She had lived worse. Still, her fingers kept moving, detailing the moment the champagne was poured in 1A and how not a single crew member had come to check on her since she was moved. When was the last time you saw injustice and chose to quietly write it down instead of letting it slip away? A soft chime rang overhead. The seatbelt sign blinked off. Passengers began to move about, calling for drinks, adjusting pillows. Evelyn remained still, the kind of stillness that speaks volumes. Not silence from defeat, but silence sharpened by purpose. The plane rose through the clouds, but Evelyn's resolve was already miles ahead. 3 hours into the flight, the cabin began to settle into its lull. Dinner trays clinked softly, shades were drawn, and whispers turned into quiet snores. Evelyn sat upright in seat 28E, her hands folded neatly over her lap, her phone now locked and silent, but she was not asleep. At the front of the plane, Vanessa, the flight attendant who had reassigned her, whispered to a male colleague by the galley. She glanced over her shoulder, eyes scanning toward the back, toward Evelyn. Her posture had changed, tense now, her voice clipped. A tablet buzzed in her hands, and a red notification pulsed at the top corner of the screen. She tapped it and froze. Evelyn Brooks. Not a name pulled from a random passenger list. The tablet revealed more than a ticket, it revealed a title. Senior partner. Strategic Equity Group. Lead investor. Atlantic Air expansion deal. Suddenly, every protocol unraveled. In the cockpit, a separate alert chimed. Executive on board. Gate staff notified. Media crew assembling at the destination airport. Her presence wasn't just known, it was now priority. And at that moment, every sneer, every delay, every accidental spill became a matter of record. Back in her seat, Evelyn opened her second phone, a slim device reserved for confidential communications. One message flashed on screen. Status confirmed, delegation awaiting arrival. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She simply powered it off and placed it back in her coat. What would you do if the very people who tried to humiliate you were about to find out they worked for you? The power had never left Evelyn. They had only mistaken her silence for absence. They had erased her name from a seat, only to find it engraved on their future. The plane was still mid-air, but the descent had already begun. For them, the moment the wheels touched down, something shifted in the cabin. The usual flurry of passengers unbuckling seatbelts was halted by a double chime overhead. Then the captain's voice came on, formal, rehearsed, and oddly tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We will be receiving a delegation on the tarmac. Disembarkation will begin once our special guest has exited the aircraft." Gasps, murmurs, people turned to one another, eyebrows raised. In first class, Vanessa stood paralyzed, her fingers clenching the service cart. Beside her, a man in a gray suit adjusted his cufflinks, no longer looking as assured. From 28E, Evelyn stood. Slow, graceful, unhurried. She stepped into the aisle like she belonged there. Because she did. Each step forward drained the cabin of noise. The same aisle that once seemed to shrink around her now parted like a stage. At the gate, a black sedan waited with the emblem of Strategic Equity Group gleaming on its door. A banner fluttered above the glass. "Welcome, Evelyn Brooks. Principal Partner, Global Investment Initiative." News crews were already in place, lights blinking, cameras aimed. Behind her, the whispers turned into stunned silence. Vanessa watched from the galley as Evelyn walked past, eyes forward, expression unreadable. There were no words exchanged. No apology could touch what had already been done. Can you imagine realizing too late that the person you tried to humiliate had the power to shape your future? Later that afternoon, the airline stock dipped sharply as word of the incident went viral. Internal emails screamed with urgency, shareholders demanded answers, and by evening, Vanessa's name was trending, not with praise, but with outrage. Actions made in quiet arrogance now echoed in public shame. Evelyn, meanwhile, never once raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. Sometimes, the most powerful reckoning is the one you never have to speak. 3 months had passed since the flight. Evelyn Brooks stood behind a simple podium in a quiet civic auditorium. Not in a boardroom, not in front of investors, but among teachers, nurses, students, janitors, and retired factory workers. The lighting was soft, the room full. She wasn't here to lecture, she was here to build. The initiative she had launched was called the Threshold Project. Its mission was not to punish, but to educate, starting with those who once stood on the wrong side of dignity. And now, as Evelyn spoke of compassion, accountability, and change, all eyes turned as a figure stepped slowly onto the stage. Vanessa. Gone was the flawless uniform. Gone were the tight smiles. In their place stood a woman, humbled, unsure, but present. She took the microphone with both hands. No script, no defense, just truth. "I thought I was just following protocol," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the truth is, I never stopped to ask myself why I felt so comfortable questioning someone who looked like her, and not someone who looked like me." The room held its breath. Vanessa spoke of the silence she used to see as professionalism, now understood as complicity, of losing her job, of the sleepless nights, of the day Evelyn's team invited her, not to a trial, but to a workshop, where she listened, where she wept, where she changed. Can you think of a moment when someone offered you grace, when you knew you didn't deserve it? Evelyn stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Vanessa's shoulder. No grand gesture, just contact. Then she turned to the audience and said, "Justice isn't about revenge. It's about creating a space where people can learn and choose to be better." And in that quiet room, no one clapped. They simply listened. Because sometimes change doesn't thunder in. It arrives in humility and the courage to admit, "I was wrong." A year had passed since Flight 417. The airline had changed its logo, its leadership, and, most importantly, its values. Training programs once treated as checkboxes were now treated as foundations. Diversity wasn't a press release anymore. It was part of the hiring process, the promotion track, the everyday rhythm of the crew. But it wasn't just about the airline. Airports across the country began displaying posters from the Threshold Project beside TSA lines and departure boards. One stood out, a silhouette of Evelyn walking with quiet purpose down the center aisle of an airplane. Below it, the words, "Respect isn't a privilege, it's your right." Inside lounges and terminals, conversations began to shift. Passengers caught themselves before assumptions formed. Staff paused before judgment surfaced. People were watching differently with intention. On a flight from Chicago to Boston, a young attendant named Grace glanced at an elderly black woman settling into 1A. The passenger struggled with her briefcase, and a man across the aisle muttered, "Wonder who she knows to be up here." Grace leaned in, smiled gently, and said, "She knows enough." A small moment, but a lasting one. Have you ever seen something shift in the world, not because someone shouted, but because someone stood still and refused to be moved? Back in her office, Evelyn Brooks sat by the window, sipping tea. Her calendar was full, her phone buzzed with interview requests. But she had no desire for spotlights. Change wasn't made on stages. It was made in aisles, in policy binders, in whispered apologies, in opened eye. She had never returned to 1A. She didn't need to. Because now, that seat and every seat like it carried her presence, not in name, but in standard. And in the skies she once crossed alone, others now traveled with dignity. The heart of Evelyn Brooks' story is this: dignity never needs to raise its voice to be powerful. In a world that often rewards noise and speed, Evelyn chose stillness, clarity, and patience. She didn't argue when her seat was taken. She didn't demand attention when she was moved to the back of the plane. Instead, she watched. She remembered. And when the time was right, the truth stood up on its own. Something deeply comforting about that, for those of us who've lived long enough to know that storms pass, but character stays. We may not all be investors or executives, but we all carry something sacred, the right to be respected. And sometimes, the most powerful response to being overlooked is not a shout, but a simple, steady refusal to disappear. Have you ever held your ground with grace, knowing the world might catch up later? Evelyn's story reminds us we don't always need to fight to win. Sometimes, we just need to remain true to ourselves and let time do the rest. In the quiet of her study, Evelyn Brooks lit a small lamp and opened a journal she hadn't touched in years. No headlines, no cameras, just soft light, steady breath, and the memory of a flight that tried to take something from her and failed. She didn't need applause. Her power had always been quiet. It lived in how she stood, how she endured, and how she chose to build rather than burn. In the months that followed, policies changed, training deepened, and passengers who once whispered judgment now learned to pause, to see. The story didn't erase the pain, but it placed a mirror where there had once been a blindfold. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe to Echoes of Racism so these voices don't fade into silence. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care, and we'll see you soon.